I don't know if you can see my title and my words down there. That's a shame. I think we might be slightly cut off. Thank you so much to Jennifer, actually, for lowering the tone before me. So I'm not fully responsible for dragging us down after such superlative beauty into such terrible depths of poor taste. But I will say I'm very happy that Jennifer has delivered a wonderful paper which works very well with mine, and certainly we've come to many of the same conclusions, although, of course, my focus is on ideas, being somebody who's coming from thinking about Louis XIV in my research work. I'm really thinking about how does this relationship between Trump and Louis XIV hold up. So, many have been quick to draw a link between the famous glittering decor of President Donald Trump's Manhattan penthouse and his private club in Florida, Mar-a-Lago, and that of Versailles. Kate Wagner, who we just met a minute ago, of the popular satirical blog McMansion's Hell, asked, "Whose style is that, Louis XIV or Donald Trump?" There might be some similarities at a cursory glance. The acres of marble, gilt capitals on columns, fountains and painted ceilings in Trump's residences nod in the direction of the Sun King's palace. Putting questions of period style aside for a moment, it's worth considering the broader implications of those comparisons. Trump's opponents are keen to point to his residences as evidence of an unscrupulous and self-serving man with despotic tendencies. Popular wisdom holds that there is a direct link between the grandiose decoration of French royal palaces and the absolutist rule rejected in the 1789 French Revolution. Versailles has come to represent a gilded style of tyrannical opulence for the privileged few at the cost of the many. But the comparison between the Sun King style and that of the 45th US president is superficial at best. Where Louis XIV dazzled the world with the superlative quality and innovative design of the Palace of Versailles, Trump's interiors reference only the surfaces, colours and basic forms of such exquisite things. This paper aims to place Trump's interiors within a broader context of contemporary and historical interior decoration and display that emulate the Sun King's palace. I contend that the decor of Trump's pseudo-palatial commissions is best understood in the tradition of nouveau riche patrons who defined the style of American success in the Gilded Age of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Ultimately, I will problematize the comparisons made between Trump and Louis XIV by proposing that the faux French grand manner style favoured by the US president is an example of cross-cultural quotation filtered through the lens of fantasy that misrepresents the historical culture that it emulates. For many today, the grand decorations commissioned by Louis XIV at the Palace of Versailles recall the extravagant decor of Donald Trump's Manhattan penthouse. When one patron of the current exhibition here at the National Gallery of Australia posted a picture of herself to Instagram, posed in front of the Hall of Mirrors backdrop, set up for just that purpose, one of her followers commented, "It reminds me of the toilets at Trump Tower." But the legendary solid gold toilets and the basins in Trump's Manhattan penthouse, a conspicuous display of a 21st century billionaire's wealth, is a far cry from the expression of monarchic power in the most public space of the Sun King's palace. Precious, malleable, inert, and eternal, gold has been used for millennia across the world to venerate the holders of temporal and celestial power. Today, it's the colour and substance of money, and is used lavishly by Trump, who uses it in his buildings as part of a broad strategy of representation as a self-made man with money to burn. As Vanity Fair's contributing editor, Fran Lebowitz, commented, in a comment that's now very well known, he's a poor person's idea of a rich person. All that stuff he shows you in his house, the gold faucets, if you won the lottery, that's what you'd buy. End quote. The Trump brand is premised on symbols of capital, expensive things, the spoils of financial success hard won through the art of the deal, to quote the title of Trump's 1987 co-written book. He is so successful, he can afford to live like a king. Leaving aside what royal status might really entail, that idiom, to live like a king, represents the daydream of life in the lap of luxury, shielded from daily rituals and tribulations that ordinary people face. His interiors conjure the apparition of palatial life, replete with opulent furnishings and finishes. That this generic palatial style recalls Versailles attests to the extraordinary success of Louis XIV's image makers, his artists and designers, in creating a style that defines what a palace looks like in the popular imagination. Not like this. It is hard to pin down specific quotations of Versailles in the furnishings of Trump's Manhattan apartment. A confusion of references to interiors and furniture made over more than 130 years in the two long reigns of Louis XIV and his great-grandson Louis XV make it impossible to classify this style in relation to a specific period. Trump's penthouse might best be described as pseudo-French grand manner. It is easy for a historian of French decorative arts to point to the errors of reference in Trump's interior design to the designs that inspire it at Versailles. The proportions are all wrong. And I can point out to you here, I don't know if you can see it, but there are these funny squat columns, tiny little entablatures, massive kind of, all the architectural elements, they don't fit what we would expect of classical proportions. They're the sort of the signs and the symbols of the kind of things that you find in palaces are there, but all of the kind of proportion that we would look at to understand and define a style can't be found at all. And proportion governs elegance in the palace of the Bourbon kings, and such errors would have been considered extremely poor taste then as they are now. But those who build dream homes that reference the age of Louis today are less interested in an accurate quotation of French period styles, and more in creating a fantasy of luxury and decadence, an imagined world that hints to royal riches. Let's look at some more. Another Chateau de Versailles, this time in Vaughan, Toronto, built by two Canadian entrepreneurs, was placed on the market in 2013. Like Trump's penthouse, it's difficult to discern too many quotations of the French palace here. Astute observers might recognise a copy of Antoine Coisevaux's Marley horses. Here we go. Flanking the gates. But the overall references are of a generic French style. Chandeliers, painted ceilings, boiserie, elaborate curtains. And it's especially difficult to find an inspiration at the real Versailles for the heated Ferrari room that this mansion boasts as its ultimate luxury. My colleague Jennifer Fern has already introduced us to David and Jackie Siegel's Versailles mansion in Florida. I'm showing you here stills from that documentary, The Queen of Versailles. For the Siegels, the dream of living like royals is made with references to royal iconography. And instead of the interlaced L's of Louis XIV cipher, I'm not sure if you can see that, but we have this very royal kind of motif of a cipher here, the S for Siegel, which appears throughout the whole design of this kind of, this is the imagined design, of course, an artist's impression of what it'll look like when it's finished. And so across those spandrels and balustrades we have those signs. A fantasy portrait of the Siegel family shows David in kingly regalia and Jackie crowned, making the dream of royal riches explicit. While the building remains unfinished, the Siegels have long been collecting French antiques to decorate their new home. A cursory glance around their warehouse in this film, and I don't know if you can see that down there, but this is their warehouse, or some of it, the sort of the stuff they've acquired, reveals very little of value among these items, and most are reproductions of mixed quality and style. There's one point where she hones in and says, those Russian eggs, what are they called, the Fabergé ones? I got the big ones. I got the big ones from the casino when they closed them down. Here's another. Perhaps the most extraordinary, and I think Bénédicte introduced us to this in her wonderful presentation too, perhaps the most extraordinary of the mansions made in homage to the French grand manner is Château Louis XIV, built by Saudi-born property developer Emad Khashoggi in Louveciennes, France, in the lands which once actually did belong to the royal estate of Versailles. The overall design of the building recalls not Versailles, but in fact, Vaux-le-Vicomte, built for the ill-fated Nicolas Fouquet and finished in 1661. And this is very strange. We know the story of Versailles as, Vaux-le-Vicomte plays a role in the story of Versailles as it's sort of the precursor to that French style, built for Fouquet, who oversteps his mark. Anyway, it's very strange that you would then call this Chateau Louis XIV, but that's another story. The quotations of Ancien Regime style here take a whimsical turn, and I hope you can see this, with what is perhaps supposed to be a Savonnerie carpet at the bottom of an indoor pool. It's no accident that the patrons of these imaginary palaces recall Versailles, as I've said. Indeed, that French art and architecture is still emulated by Trump and his super-rich contemporaries attests to the enduring success of Jean-Baptiste Colbert's plan to make France a world leader in arts and luxury industries. And we've had so many papers in this conference that have shown us the mercantile ambitions of France in the luxury industry, so I'm glad that point has been made well for me before. Here he is. This print was published in 1664, the same year that Colbert purchased the office of Surintendant des Bâtiments du Roi, the superintendent of the king's works, something like that, which placed him in the charge of royal palaces, gardens, and their contents. The new Surintendant reinvigorated the French luxury industry, founding manufactories for tapestry and furniture, glass, lace, textiles, everything that would be needed for the decoration of noble residences and indeed of their inhabitants. In 1665, he became superintendent of finances too, enabling him to impose restrictions on the importation of foreign goods to boost the French economy and to ensure that French aristocrats would buy local. These policies had far-reaching effects, and by the end of Louis XIV's reign, French fashion and design was envied and emulated across the world, and we've seen that again with Kimberley's paper. With this in mind, it's possible to see a dual function for the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. It was a statement of royal magnificence and glory. Its impressive scale and shimmering reflective surfaces served to dazzle and disorientate the visitor, and the cycle of Louis XIV's history on the ceiling, painted by Charles Lebrun, which detailed the political and military acts that made such a display of magnificence possible. But it was also an advertisement for the new luxury industries that Colbert had helped to establish in France, with exquisite silver furniture from the Gobelin manufactory and mirrors and windows made in Paris at the new royal manufactory of mirrors and windows, glass, sorry. The opulent display of material wealth at Louis XIV's court was both a demonstration of power and stability for a monarchy that had been troubled by civil war in the early years of the reign, and it was a means to promote French industry. So successful was this strategy that Versailles immediately became a model for palace architecture and royal representation, and continued to inspire royal patrons in the centuries that followed. The Versailles style was adopted by the robber barons and railroad millionaires of New York in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to lend an air of legitimacy to newly founded fortunes. One of the most flamboyant patrons of the Gilded Age, Alva Vanderbilt, used her husband's fortune to commission Richard Morris Hunt to design a mansion at 665th Avenue, occupying an entire block between 51st and 52nd Streets, with finials and turrets to make it look like a French Renaissance manor, and this came to be known as the Petit Château. The French firm, Jules Allard & Sons, were hired to create magnificent interiors in period French styles, including a neo-Rococo salon that started a trend for that period among the rich of New York in that time. Jules Allard & Sons likely supplied boiseries taken from 18th century French buildings and modified them for this room. The firm was known for its skill at incorporating and expanding pre-existing antique elements in their designs. The salon contains a mix of high-quality reproduction furniture and genuine period pieces, including 3 18th century Beauvais tapestries after designs by François Boucher. One of these is visible in the background, the scene of Apollo and Clytie, and you can see this isn't the one actually that was in the Vanderbilt collection, but it's the same, pretty much. And here we see a textbook example of conspicuous consumption, a term coined by 19th century sociologist Thorsten Veblen to explain the extravagant displays of Vanderbilt and their new money contemporaries. Veblen argued that open acts of lavish spending on buildings, art, and antiques were a means of establishing the real or perceived power and prestige of individuals who held an otherwise precarious social position. The Vanderbilts and their kind surrounded themselves with the very best porcelain, furniture, tapestry, sculpture, paintings created for nobles of the French court in the 17th and 18th centuries. In doing so, they defined a rich style that I would argue has come to represent the luxury that success in business brings for those who had fought their way up to the top. But where these wealthy industrialists sought to attain social prestige by association with authentic objects that belonged to a lost world of Ancien Regime France, Trump's interiors mimic only the most superficial aspects of French court art and design, and the exuberant recreations and displays of it by tycoons of America's Gilded Age. This is particularly evident in the additions that Trump made to his private club, Mar-a-Lago, in Palm Beach, Florida, in the 1990s. Trump purchased Mar-a-Lago in 1985 as a private residence that he, his family, and business associates enjoyed for a decade before the complex was transformed into a private club and spa because of financial difficulties, it must be said, on his part. The villa was once one of the most prestigious estates in Palm Beach, built by American serial heiress and businesswoman Marjorie Merriweather Post in the 1920s. It is a quintessential example of architectural historicism as conspicuous consumption. Post's interior designer, Joseph Urban, whose clients included Emperor Franz Joseph and the Khedive of Egypt, created a Moorish-style villa for the patron. 36,000 antique tiles were imported from Spain, and 20,000 roof tiles came from a Cuban castle. In a blend of quotations typical of historicism, the ceiling of the main salon is a copy of that found in the Accademia in Venice, and the villa was once decorated with antiques, albeit of varying style and quality. I'm showing you, this is it actually today. Trump bought it wholesale. This is that fake Accademia ceiling of the 20s. Trump bought the villa and its contents for a knockdown price. He did it through a very interesting deal. I'll say no more. But it's interesting when you look at the kind of old pictures of Mar-a-Lago and the new pictures, you can find some of those objects are still displayed there. So he did wholesale take Mar-a-Lago, but he did make one major addition. Here it is. When Trump transformed Mar-a-Lago into a private club, he added what some have described as a Louis XIV-style ballroom, decorated with a reported $7 million of gold leaf. In truth, this ballroom has very little to do with the style of the Sun King. The proportions of squat columns and wide lintels make for an awkward composition. The mix of period references is jarring. The ceiling of the large bay window area vaguely, very vaguely, recalls Rococo motifs of the Salon de la Princesse at the Hôtel Soubise. And I expect Mimi's going to be cringing right now, but here we go. But the correspondence is not close enough to recognise a direct quotation, and it would be better explained in terms of a kind of faux French manner. Trump's designs are better understood in the tradition of architectural follies and rich interiors created by Post and the Vanderbilts and others than the original schemes designed for French nobles. I argue that Trump has drawn upon the aesthetic of the Gilded Age. But unlike the European-style salons designed for the new money of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, filled with genuine treasures, nothing in Trump's fantasy interiors are real. The comparison between Trump's interiors and those of Versailles might best be understood in terms of cross-cultural quotation and mistranslation, analogous to fantastical representations of Asian cultures in 18th century chinoiserie designs. And I'd just like to take this moment to apologise to Christophe Huet, who is in fact a fantastic painter, for putting him up here as a comparison between Trump and the 18th century. In those examples too, in these examples of the chinoiserie, a strange blend of forms, stripped of cultural meaning, were used for purely decorative effect to add to the splendour of a European salon. Chinoiserie designs conjure an imagined land of perfume and indolence that only vaguely resemble the places and artefacts that inspired them. Likewise, the decadent design of fantasy palaces made for Trump, the Siegels and their contemporaries hold only a superficial association with Versailles. The stakes are very different, of course, as generations of post-colonial theorists have demonstrated. In the context of Western imperial discourse, the misquotation of non-Western cultures have serious political implications. Representing Eastern people as indolent, lascivious, and unchanging serves to disempower them, and the same cannot be said for an historical culture long since gone, no longer holding any claim to temporal power. But I would argue that the emulation of Ancien Regime style by contemporary capitalists has a corrosive effect on the public perception of the culture that generated those forms. The popular media and the public at large see the codes of opulence, the signifiers of excess capital, gold, marble, crystal chandeliers, loosely arranged in pseudo-French style in Trump's buildings, as a reference to Versailles. This comparison serves to perpetuate common misconceptions about royal representation. Rather than reading Versailles as it was intended, as a symbol of good kingship, the abundance and flourishing of French industry that follows stable rule, the codes of Louis XIV's magnificence are misunderstood as representing the hubris of a man who sought to live in the lap of luxury, like a 21st century capitalist. It's a strange idea, Louis XIV is like a 21st century capitalist. The fantasy of luxury that the Trump brand aims for by emulating the surfaces, colours and shapes and forms developed for French noble residences then, I argue, does serious damage to the reputation of the Sun King and his heirs. And I'd like to end by way of a coda. My study of the interior design of Trump's residences, part of a broader project that looks at the emulations and translations of Louis XIV's style, began when he was running for office, but few thought that he would win the election. While Trump may have long harboured presidential ambitions, and that's something people have discussed, the design of his Manhattan apartment in the 1980s and the ballroom at Mar-a-Lago in the 1990s were conceived as part of the Trump luxury brand. I contend that the Trump style was developed to promote an image of personal success, won through canny business dealings, in that sense, a kind of American dream, or an example of the American dream. The message is a simple one. If you make the right deals, you can live like a king. All comfort, no responsibility. The forms that represent monarchic power were stripped of their stately function. All that changed when Trump was elected and began to use his Manhattan penthouse and private club in Florida as a backdrop for the official presidential functions that he would hold. Mar-a-Lago has become the Winter White House, and the codes of luxury have reverted once more to symbols of power. Ironically, the woman who built Mar-a-Lago, Marjorie Merriweather Post, had intended her villa to become an official Florida residence for the American president. She left the estate to the federal government on her death in 1973, but they eventually gave it back to her daughters when it was deemed too expensive to maintain, and indeed they didn't really like it. So, the Winter White House now fulfills the functions that Post had intended. But a fantasy of kingly wealth frames the leader of the free world in a Florida villa scorched by the solar rays of the Sun King style. Thank you very much.